time today, Andrew. As we've briefly been touching on, we're going to be discussing interagency task force leadership, and I've got some questions, but as mentioned, I'd like to delve into some of your thought processes as we go along as well. So, as mentioned, we would like to talk about your role as a coordinator for the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, but we also appreciate that you've had a lot of experience in interagency environments. Do you have any questions before I head off?
No, look, thanks for thinking to include me, and yeah, I look forward to it.
Sounds good. So first question, please outline your leadership experiences in interagency environments.
Yeah, so I guess I've been the National Coordinator for the National Bushfire Recovery Agency for about 10 months now. Prior to that, I was a police officer for 30 years, and I was a police officer at the federal level. And the reality is there's very little that the Australian Federal Police do that we don't do in partnership with somebody else. In fact, policing generally is very little that we don't do in partnership with someone else. So I guess I have the fortune to have been experienced in a range of task forces, from large international alliances where we agree at a global level to do certain things and share objectives, down to that very macro, granular, operational need driving the creation of a task force. Stepping into this role, into the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, was quite different, partly because I was stepping out of a policing environment into, I guess, more of a public service environment, but also I think I was stepping out of an environment that had become quite well attuned to creating task forces into an environment where I don't think that we were probably quite in that same place. So, yeah, we needed to do a lot of work to set up the National Bushfire Recovery Agency at a time, of course, that we were also trying to do the job, which wasn't ideal.
Are you able to reflect on that experience of actually standing up the task force whilst doing the job at the same time?
Yeah, look, I mean, to be really honest with you, it was chaos, but chaos in a good way. I think we often think of chaos as a negative. You can achieve a lot in chaos because people are very focused, people are energised, people are enthusiastic and want to get the job done. So those early days of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, we churned out a heck of a lot of work in the first 2 or 3 weeks simply out of enthusiasm, motivation, adrenaline at times, but also because there was such a strong focus and a really strong need. I think it's always easier to galvanise people's efforts if there's a very clear goal. And we had a very clear goal, and that was to assist communities and individuals that were affected by the 1920 bushfire season. So while we're very focused on what could we do immediately, how could we use this energy, this enthusiasm, this support to get things done, I also needed to be conscious that I needed to put time aside or have someone put time aside to help set up the agency. What would be the long-term goals and aspirations of the agency? What do we need? What capabilities would we require? So while there was a lot of effort and energy in those first days and weeks, I also made sure that there was some time being put aside to creating that longer-term vision for the agency.
And I'll touch on vision in a few questions' time, but in terms of practical tips on how you enabled people and how you kind of harnessed that energy in terms of planning tools or anything like that?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot in terms of planning tools, which is probably a lesson that we can learn. And I do think there's an element in government, as there was in police, and I'm sure there is in other aspects of society, of reinventing the wheel, learning the same lessons that somebody before has done. So I had in my mind that I wanted to document as much as we could along the way so that people didn't have to relearn that lesson. But I think the biggest things that we did in the early stages was trust. I had a lot of new people around me, some of which I knew but hadn't worked a great deal with, and many of which I didn't know. So you don't have very long to form your team, to go through that normal forming, storming, norming process, which is made simpler by the fact that there's a lot of work to be done and everybody just puts their shoulder to the wheel. So in those early stages, you just have to trust a lot. And you do that in a sensible way, because if you're responsible for the task force, you've got to make sure you're achieving the outcomes. But you really need to understand what the capabilities are of the people around you. Don't compete with those capabilities, try to complement those capabilities, don't replicate and duplicate them, and draw upon the skills that people have given you.
Thanks very much for that, Andrew. If I could draw a little bit out about that, trust is a key component of culture. Did you observe any other need to build culture within the task force?
Yeah, I did, and that's probably a personal objective of mine. I think culture is very important. I think the culture of an agency, the culture of a team, a task force will in many ways determine your success or failure. Yes, you have to have strategy, yes, to have a vision, a plan, and all of that, but if you don't have the right culture, then you'll never achieve what you want to achieve. So very early on, I had a vision that I wanted to create a culture, and I wanted to create a strategic intent for the organisation that was probably a little bit different to what you would find in most public service organisations. So by that, I was very focused on our behaviours, I was very focused on the how we did things as much as the what we were trying to produce. And what was driving my thinking there in large part was, at the Commonwealth level, we have our hands on some very big levers of policy. But my job was to translate those very big levers of policy to something very granular for a victim of a fire on the south coast or in Queensland or in Kangaroo Island, who really is agnostic about which level of government's helping them. They don't care about the machinations that sit behind all the policy, they just need to know that they've been helped. So I needed to bridge those two, and the way that I've gone about doing that, and the way I think that we should always do it, is to create a culture that values how we do things as much as what we do. So the 1%ers are important. Seeing our challenge through the eyes of the victim rather than seeing it through the eyes of the Commonwealth. And yeah, that's not an easy thing to do, because it's not natural, particularly for government, to always try and put themselves in the shoes of the victim. But we've done that, and we continue to do it, and it creates uncomfortable, difficult conversations sometimes, but it means that we have an ability to translate policy into something meaningful.
That was great to hear, Andrew, and I'll probably say that a lot throughout. I always enjoy having a chat to people to actually learn that, and actually the actual practical tips on how to build a culture and the reasons why we need to build a culture. So yeah. I might backtrack a little bit and just ask you about your previous experiences and how those experiences enabled you in your current role.
Yeah, so I think coming through a career in policing from the junior level, the junior ranks through to finish up my career as Commissioner, I saw a change in policing. I saw us transition from a period where police would always work together if they had to when I left, and as I see policing now, there's a desire to work together because everybody knows it's in everyone's interest. And I think it's amazing what you can achieve if nobody cares who shares the glory or who gets the glory. Sometimes I think we get a little bit too focused on who will stand up and announce the results or who will bask in the positive and forget that that's not what it's about. So, I've learned along the way that you can do a lot from the back seat of the car. And I'm a firm believer that you don't need to be always at the front of the charge to be the leader, that sometimes you can do a heck of a lot just one level back. And I think that's been important in the bushfire context, but it was also really important to me in a policing context, that if we were always adding value to a task force rather than just making up the numbers in a task force, then I was much happier. You never want to be there just to make up numbers. You want to make sure you're bringing something to the table. And I took that with me from policing into this current bushfire arrangement. So what's the value add that the Commonwealth brings to natural disaster response and recovery? How do we make it easier for the states? How do we make it easier for local government? How do we deliver a better outcome for the community? So that kind of drives a lot of my thinking in that space.
And may I ask, what is the value add that the agency has brought for the community?
Yeah, look,
from your perspective,
I think hopefully there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
I was responding predominantly to the 1920 bushfire season, which was unprecedented. That word is used probably a little bit too much, but it was multi-jurisdictional. It lasted more than 6 months, and it tested the frameworks that we've relied upon in Australia in a way that nobody quite anticipated. So what we've been able to bring is a national picture. We've been able to bring some consistency across jurisdictions to make sure that the experience of a victim on one side of a border is the same as the experience of a victim on the other side of a border. And that could be state borders, it could be local government borders. So I think we've been able to do that. We've also been able to make sure that the Commonwealth effort was coordinated and to make best endeavours to ensure that between ourselves and the states and our local government partners or our non-government partners, that again, the experience of the victim was it didn't matter who was helping them, they knew they would get the help. So it wasn't a matter of having to go to separate parts of the government system or separate parts of the non-government system to get support. you could find a one-stop shop if that was necessary. Now, we had a long way to go in achieving that, but I think we've taken us the country a long way along that journey.
And I think that's incredible that you've mentioned about testing the frameworks, because it's like we spoke about briefly before, it's what can you learn from this experience and what can be gone. So the next one, and you have touched a little bit on it about creating a culture as part of your vision, but how did you develop and articulate your leadership vision for the role?
Yeah, so COVID made it hard, to be really honest with you. And when we first went into the COVID lockdown, of course, as an agency, we were very immature. We'd only been together for a matter of a few months. We were still onboarding people into the organisation. We were still training people as to what we were trying to do. So COVID did make that very hard, and we had to adapt really quickly to find ways to reach out to the organisation virtually. What we did is we created what I called a statement of intent, and it's a document that probably has no grounding in any authority other than it's important to us. And the statement of intent encapsulates in pretty simple words, terms and phrases that you don't normally see in a government formal document, a strategic document, but it says what I want from the agency. I want us to be problem solvers. I want us to be victim centric. I want us to do the 1%ers and go the extra mile to do a little bit more. It outlines some of those behaviours of how I expect us as an organisation to treat each other, and how that will flow on to how we treat the community, how we'll treat our partners, how we'll work with our partners. So we did that through a series of consultations. Basically everybody in the organisation, which is an advantage when you're a small organisation, had a say and had an opportunity to shape that. And it was very interesting to see that I wanted us to be quite ambitious. I wanted to set a lofty aspiration, and I didn't set it because I thought we would always meet it. I set it because I wanted us to reach for it. And if we didn't reach it, I knew that we'd still be doing something pretty good in the process. And that, again, seemed a bit of a challenge to a lot of my organisation, because within government we're very conservative. We say what we will do, and then we go about trying to do it. And I probably tested that a little bit by trying to be a bit more ambitious and be a bit more aspirational. And now I make no apologies for that. I'd rather us aim high, because I think that's what the community expects. So it was really interesting to see that as we went through that consultation process, people came on board, and I think celebrate that a lot more now.
If we could just touch on the types of agencies within the task force. So you mentioned earlier Andrew Hocking and things like that. So if you could just touch on those agencies and how you've integrated them in terms of behaviours and cultures.
Yeah, so we're an organisation of around 100 people, and at last count I think we have drawn people from 30 different organisations. So you can imagine that's 30 different cultures, 30 different aspirations, 30 different visions for what their role would be. The ADF and the department were fantastic to us, and they were very supportive in giving me a 2-star general, which was great, and not just a 2-star general, someone that is very experienced and is a great leader, as well as a lot of defence personnel who are very good at delivering on a task. And I really needed that, especially in the early days where there was a lot of logistics to what we were doing, and there was a lot of moving parts, and the ADF do that better than any other part of government. But I drew policy expertise from Treasury or from the Department of Environment, from Finance, obviously Prime Minister and Cabinet, Department of Home Affairs. So it was a range of people who were policy experts, economic experts, delivery agencies, and bringing them all together was a lot of fun. Had its challenges, if I'm really honest with you, but I guess I could have seen some of those challenges as a roadblock to what I was trying to do, or I could try and embrace it. Now I opted to embrace it and try and see it from their perspective. So when Defence come into the agency, what's their perspective? So they're coming from a uniform discipline into a public service type of agency. How do they see my style of leadership? How do they see what we're trying to achieve? They've probably never come across cabinet submissions before, or the pace of cabinet submissions. So, I have a pretty empathetic approach. I try and see it from the perspective of my partners, and I do think that helps in success or otherwise of a task force. I mean, if we only ever see the work of a task force through our own eyes and not through our partners' eyes, then we're never going to get the full picture.
And if I may, I touch on this, on your challenges as well, but if we're reflecting on your initial period of leadership, what were your top priorities and any additional challenges that you faced?
So look, my immediate priorities was to create momentum. I needed to create momentum, which I knew would also create a little bit of a galvanising factor to the agency, as well as send a signal to the community and to the government that I didn't want to be seen as just another bureaucracy, that we were going to try and deliver and we were going to try and be action orientated. And that's still my position today. I'd rather be action orientated more so than policy focused. So in the early stages, we wanted to deliver as much as we could and create that momentum. And that, I guess, is that chaotic period that I talked about. I think we went before government on twice a day, every day for a week and a half with ideas and what we were trying to do. That helped create that momentum. It also helped get everybody focused. And the bit I loved in those early stages, we were very rank agnostic. It didn't matter if I as the CEO or head of the agency or Andrew Hocking as my deputy or somebody we just grabbed. We had graduates out of PM&C. Everybody did whatever needed to be done. And I think that did create a culture of we're going to roll our sleeves up here and do what has to be done. Now over time things settle down and you have to get some processes, otherwise you can't sustain that. But in those early days I just wanted to create momentum and I wanted to give people a reason to believe and trust us that we could do what we were asked to do. We could make a difference.
Touching on the processes, may I just ask what kind of processes you drew on, so incident management team structure or anything like that?
Look, I probably defaulted back to a more command and control model at first because that was what I was reasonably comfortable with, and I knew it was. I had a large number of military personnel came on early, but we didn't. I wouldn't say we held on to that for too long. We quickly fell into a rhythm of the best person for the job, and I would like to think that we've maintained that to today. But we needed to also find some structure because the other thing, of course, is I know in myself that I enjoy ambiguity. I see opportunity in grey and ambiguity. Most people don't. Most people see uncertainty and anxiety. So I needed to find a balance there and we needed to settle things down so that people coming into the agency knew what their job would be and were very clear about what was expected of them. So yeah, that didn't take too long to start to settle that down. And again, I'm still to this day, 10 months down the track, conscious of not over-engineering the process because I don't want to lose the beautiful part of the chaoticness that means you get things done.
And you did touch on it briefly, but could you provide some reflections on interfacing with the communities and how you built a relationship with the communities to understand their needs?
Yeah, look, I think you have to be a good listener and you need to be on receive mode, not transmit mode. And sometimes people don't need you to solve their problem, they just want to know that you've listened and that you've heard what they've got to say. So again, in those fairly early stages, some of those conversations were quite confronting. You're dealing with people who've lost loved ones or property, and really it was a matter of building trust through listening and being genuine. Don't promise something that you can't deliver, but give hope and make sure that in your interactions you're being authentic. So, and that transitions, of course, because victims go through all sorts of stages of grief, and no two victims of a natural disaster or fire in this case will travel the same trajectory. And I learnt that very quickly, that again, I couldn't assume that everybody was in the same place at the same time or that their aspirations were the same. So that was why I had to be a good listener, as have all of my agency that have been out and about, is listen, be empathetic, find ways to help. And if you can't help, don't just push aside the concerns, find someone who can help them. And that was important to me, that we didn't just deliver what the Commonwealth could do, we made sure we delivered what the person needed, and it didn't matter who delivered it, frankly.
Thank you for sharing that, Andrew. And now you mentioned it about ambiguity and chaos. How did you respond to any uncertainty, both in your role and objective? So
I probably like to hold ambiguity and grey for a little bit longer than most people. I don't rush to solve or clarify ambiguity if I think on a balance that we can stay in it a little bit longer, because I see opportunity. And I feel that often if you jump to a conclusion or you try and get clarity where it may not be ready to be clear, then it's very hard to come back from that and you set a course of events. So in those early days I had to make judgments, a lot of judgments, about which were the issues that I needed to just allow to bubble along for a little bit longer and wait and see where they landed, rather than those issues that I needed to intervene on. And mostly the issues you need to intervene on are those where there's someone who is personally affected by what by the lack of clarity, or there might be a political need for something to be settled, there might be a desire to get funding in place and you've got to lock something down. But where you can hold in ambiguity and wait and see and get more information, invariably things aren't so ambiguous once you get the information you need.
And how did you get the information you needed?
Contacts, networks, asking a heck of a lot of questions. I'm sure at times that my team were very frustrated with me, asking what might have seemed like really simple and obvious questions, but I needed to understand it. I needed to understand not just what the answer was, but I needed to own the answer and actually understand it. So, I ask a lot of questions, and I encourage anybody to do that. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking questions. So that was how I filled most of those grey areas and those gaps.
And you have touched a little bit on it, but do you have any practical tips or guidance for how to establish effective relationships, both, like you mentioned, with communities right up to the political levels?
Look, I think number one is just be genuine. And there's nothing that the community, especially a community who's hurting, will see through quicker than if the person sitting in front of them is not genuine, is not authentic. So being genuine is the number one. And frankly, that works for me with government as well. Government, especially at a time of crisis, government wants to just know what you think, and they want you to be honest. And for me, I'm always going to be pretty frank in my advice and my views, because I do listen a lot. I ask a lot of questions, and I think about what that means to me, or what that might mean to the problem I'm trying to solve. But yeah, it's authenticity.
And you did mention the agencies that you've brought together. How did you build coherence amongst the many agencies, the 30 that you mentioned?
Yeah. With great difficulty at times, but simple things make a difference. The environment you work in makes a difference. So when we first were established, we were squatters in somebody else's location. We literally were sitting on top of each other around coffee tables, in lounge chairs, doing the job. Once we were able to move out of there and find a home and create an environment that was our environment, then things started to fall together. So environment's important. And for me, an environment without doors and walls and offices is much more important if you want a free-flowing exchange of ideas than an environment that's full of everybody locking themselves away in an office. So the space that we've created for ourselves is a very open office space, is very accessible. My door's always open. I know my deputy's doors are always open. We walk the floor, we talk, and we're just another person in the agency. And I think that helps create, firstly, that authenticity, but also it makes people realise that it's a safe environment. It's somewhere where they can share, they can make mistakes, they can learn.
All right, so that covers off on that. Now touching on what preparation did you have for your role? Did you have any, and flow on from that, is there any knowledge, training or education gaps that you identified?
Plenty of knowledge gaps still exist to this day, so we're all learning, and I'm learning. Look, I had no preparation for this job. Like everybody else, I spent Christmas, New Year watching the unfolding disaster around us, frankly wondering if there was something that I could do to contribute, because we all have that desire to want to help community. I wasn't expecting the phone call from the Prime Minister when it came, and within less than 48 hours after that phone call, I was in the office standing up the agency. So I drew on my previous experiences. I drew on everything that I could from my life as a police officer and the experiences I had, outside policing, I guess, to put that together. But no, there's no break glass and here's the plan or here's the protocol. And to a degree, I don't know that would have helped me, because I think that it was a reasonably fluid time. But at the same time, I think there is a gap in our thinking, that there isn't a way that we can learn what are the basics, what are the pitfalls, what are the bits to avoid, and what should you try and aim for. So I would have benefited from that, and I spoke to a lot of people in those early days. I rang other people I knew who'd been in similar situations with natural disasters, because I was coming to it fresh. People who'd set up other responses to natural disasters in the past, and asked them their experience basically. So I just drew on whatever I could, frankly.
You mentioned, I'm interested because one of the key purposes of the project is for future interagency leaders.
Yep.
So that knowledge that you gain from others, would you like to share it with us so we can actually capture what you learnt or your own experiences? What knowledge you would have liked for the start of that?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing I'd say is, from a recovery from a disaster perspective, the clear advice that everybody said to me is get out there and talk to the community. Make this a local response, not a government Canberra-led response. Now, I think while that's relevant to recovery from disaster, I think it's relevant to all task forces. What's your objective here? And talk to the people, or look at the problem you're trying to solve, not from your perspective, but from someone else's perspective. And that will give you a much clearer sense of what you need to do. The other things that I was told in those early days was take time out of the chaos to try and set a vision, to try and set a plan, to think about what you're trying to do. That's important. Take time out to think about your capabilities that you're going to need. And then once you've thought about them, realise they're going to change. So don't lock yourself into a plan too quickly, because you will need to adjust it. So be flexible, be adaptive, I guess, in that respect, and that's important for any task force. I think it's rare that we would develop a task force, especially in government sense, but even in a policing or a military sense, where there wasn't something that you're trying to respond to. And generally, it's a crisis of some description. So you don't have the luxury of a lot of time to lead in and think about it. So you've got to draw on what other people have done. So, I went back and I looked at, for instance, the North Queensland flood plans to see what I could learn from that. I looked at the drought plans to see what I could learn from that. I looked at cyclones and other bushfires. I looked at the reports of other Royal Commissions and other inquiries into bushfires. And, I wouldn't say I pored over each one of them and looked at every recommendation, but I got a feel for what were the key messages that they were trying to say.
You mentioned the capabilities, especially of other agencies. Do you have any reflection on whether there's opportunity to have greater knowledge about other agency capabilities before a task force is stood up?
Yeah, I think there is. Of course, part of the challenge is you need to know what your capabilities are that you need, and that's difficult. But yeah, it clearly, from those 30-odd agencies that have come together to form the MBRA, there's a whole range of skills. There's organisational skills that somebody brings because of where they came from. So people from the Department of Environment, you would expect to have a good environment policy perspective. But individuals have skills as well, and individuals have their life outside of work. So learning that you've got individuals whose hobby or interest might be about the environment, or hobby or interest might be about tourism, or, we also did simple things like I asked across the organisation who had family or friends in bushfire affected areas, who'd grown up in bushfire affected areas. I sought those capabilities as well. So it's not just the formal capabilities, it's understanding who you've got around you and what they bring, what their whole self brings to the table. Now, we don't have a good understanding across government of individual skills, and we don't have a good understanding across government of organisational skills. So understanding that if you're going to get people from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, you're going to get really good and analytical thinkers of policy. People who work fast, smart, and can get things in front of the PM and know what the PM needs. If I get someone from Treasury, then I'm probably going to get a strong economic mind who's going to take a little bit longer because they've got to step through a far deeper analytical process to tell me what I need about the economics of a bushfire affected community. It all adds up to be the rich tapestry of what you need.
And how do you think, as a Commonwealth, we should go about capturing that knowledge and documenting it?
So I know there's been, across the Commonwealth and different agencies, we've tried on a number of occasions to do skills audits, where we understand what the skills of an individual, what the skills of an area, what the skills of an agency are. We've never quite nailed that, largely because it's a fairly transient population. People move between departments a lot. But I know that the APSC, the Public Service Commission, are trying to get better at this and are working very hard on it. I think that's invaluable because, rather than relying on word of mouth or references from trusted colleagues, if I could go to someone and say, I really need someone who can give me strong analytical advice about the forestry industry and the impacts in the Snowy Monaro area of the bushfires, who do I go to? I had to rely on word of mouth. I had to rely on contacts and colleagues to tell me who the best people were. There was no one repository to go to and get that. Now, it's going to be difficult because we are transient, but I don't think we should not try and do it.
So you have mentioned that there was a very strong culture of collaboration across the agencies. Are there any other characteristics of the environment that you think promoted such a positive culture of collaboration?
Oh, I just think that the mission, the vision that we were trying to do, the objective, was such a strong galvanising fact. I mean, who wasn't affected by the bushfires in 1920? Most people, if they didn't have a family member or a friend, didn't have to go too far in their network to find somebody who was in the fires or lost something in the fires. And I don't think you should ever underestimate the power that that brings of people's emotional connection to the problem that you're trying to fix. For Canberra in particular, and with such a strong affinity to the South Coast, so many people knew someone that had lost something. So I think the ability at the Commonwealth level to take your hard policy work and actually give it real meaning, I think that was a galvanising point. That was what brought people together, got them very focused.
I think it's interesting. I think you're the first one that's linked policy and outcomes and operational outcomes like that. So it's definitely your perspective is, it's really interesting. So, but I'll keep going with my questions. Did you observe any impediments to collaboration, and if so, how did you seek to overcome them?
Look, there's always impediments. I guess most of them just came from a position of a lack of knowledge, not a poor intent, or certainly I never saw any malicious intent. I just think that occasionally people didn't realise what the person next door was able to do, or what another agency's role might be. So we certainly tripped over each other a few times, and I have no doubt that we tripped over other agencies, and at times probably made ourselves a little bit unwelcome because we were pushing the boundaries. And as I've said a few times, I wanted us sometimes to be the rock in the shoe. I don't want us having a confrontation with other agencies, but I want agencies and departments to know that we're there and that we're trying to deliver an outcome for the community. So, that's how I guess we got over some of those barriers, is just to keep reminding people that this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, clarity of role. And as we went along and understood what other departments were doing, what other agencies' roles were, what the state and territory and local governments had to do, and even within our agencies, people might have individual expertise. Once we learnt that, a lot of those barriers went away. So most of it was just a lack of knowledge, not malintent.
And you mentioned the mission. How did you measure or understand progress towards achieving your mission?
Yeah, we're still working on that, to be honest. We've created a fairly lofty aspirational vision, and that is that the experience of everybody affected by the bushfires will be improved as a result of our existence, in short words. How do you measure that? So you can really only measure it through people's experiences. So again, I think we sometimes are very focused on measuring the inputs, so how much money has been spent, how many grants have been given, how many projects have we supported. We're trying to transition that now to what impact has it had? How's that improved the lives or the experiences of somebody who went through the fires? So there's a lot of work to do there. I think we're very good at the first bit. We're very good at reporting numbers and statistics. We're not quite as good at reporting the impact, and that's what we're working on at the moment.
Do you have any early observations about the impact that you're having?
Yeah, look, I think that's, you will always hear about where people are falling through the cracks, or where the policy's not quite working for the individual needs of somebody, and that's understandable. And what we do is we tailor it to every individual that we possibly can. But I think overall, the community is recovering. Physically, things are being rebuilt. The bigger challenge, of course, is the far more difficult one. The mental and well-being challenges will take years. The economic impact to some of these communities will take decades, possibly, especially now after COVID has been such a hit on our economy. So I guess it's two stages. I can count every bridge that's been rebuilt, every sporting field that's been redeveloped, or toilet block or home that's been rebuilt. That's one measure. The longer term measure is the community more resilient than it was before? Is it better able to deal with another shock like this than it was before? That's going to take a lot longer, and that's where my focus is.
From your time, do you have any observations about how you articulate resilience?
There's a lot of definitions of resilience. I guess I'd put it in a couple of ways. How prepared is a community for disaster? how quickly can they bounce back from the inevitability of disasters happening, and how is government supporting them to make sure that what we do builds the community back better than it was before. So if it was a wooden bridge before that burnt down with a fire, are we building back with a fire-resistant material? But I think the most important part of resilience is a little bit harder to grab, and that's, is the community able to bounce back quicker? Is it more flexible? Is it more adaptable? Is it more ready to deal with it, rather than a disaster coming and hitting a community and so knocking the wind out of it that it can't come back? Resilience is about your malleability and your strength and your flexibility. I think that's what we're trying to focus on.
You mentioned the government assistance. Has there been any learning from this experience to turn it into a different policy or adapt policy?
Yeah.
And if so, what your reflections are on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, yeah, as much as our resources are thin, we have dedicated some resources to what we are calling learning and adaptation, to make sure that the lessons that we're picking up along the way aren't just recorded, but actually somebody picks up and deals with it. Because of course, it's not a lesson if we don't action it, and we haven't learnt it if we don't change. So yeah, absolutely, we're looking at, and I think it's important for any task force to make sure that you are tracking what you're learning and what's working and what's not. So data management, for instance, is always a challenge on government level. How do we manage data? Do our IT systems support what we're trying to achieve? How does data get shared between states and territories? What can we do better? And we're still looking at it through the perspective of a victim. So when a victim walks into a recovery centre, are they overwhelmed by what they see, which is the general experience? Or what have we learnt that can make that experience as they step through the recovery much simpler, much plainer? And that's simple things, like I said before, how do we become a one-stop shop? How do we make sure that whatever door a victim knocks on, there's no wrong door, they'll get help. So we're learning that, and we've dedicated resources to what we're calling learning and adaptation. Some of the lessons we can put into place immediately, some are going to be medium term, and some are going to be long-term policy shifts. And I think we need to do all of that.
You mentioned the one-stop shop, and how was your interface with civil society, for example, Red Cross and things like that?
Yeah, so for me coming into this, I hadn't dealt with charities, I hadn't dealt with the Red Cross in any meaningful way. So I've learned a heck of a lot about their Red Cross's auxiliary role, and probably my naivety, I would have described Red Cross as a charity, but they're a lot more than a charity. They're an auxiliary arm of government in a civil role. So I think they have a role to play. I think that we haven't optimised the system of charities, and again, we need to understand that the 1920 bushfire season and the devastation completely strained the charities as well. And we saw that come out in public anguish at times. But they worked really hard. They're not perfect, and their systems were pushed and stretched to the limit as well. So we're working with them to say, how can we do this better next time? Where can we get the crossovers to be less of a burden? How can we optimise what you do to make sure that you're not replicating what the Salvation Army are doing, or what Red Cross or St Vinny's or whoever it might be? There's a lot of charities or non-government organisations. So I found that interaction really good because we had a common goal. So even though they weren't formally part of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, we set up regular forums with all of our partners. In fact, Major General Hocking has them as much as every fortnight, regular roundtables, where we listen to their problems, they hear each other's problems, and we try and collectively solve them. And that's worked really well for us. I think it's engendered a lot more trust. It's engendered a lot more partnerships and built relationships in areas that we didn't have them before. And again, we didn't get it all right for this past disaster season, but I think we'll learn a lot of lessons for the next.
And you have touched on some of the characteristics of an interagency environment. Do you have any other specific characteristics of a positive interagency or multi-agency environment?
Look, I think for me, the ones that have been the most successful have generally been the ones that have been the most enjoyable. And I don't mean that the task that you're trying to deal with is always enjoyable, but enjoyable insofar as you're working with good people on a shared vision and mission. I think that's important. Firstly, shared vision and mission. And that's not just a shared objective, but it's an understanding of how collectively we want to reach that objective. I think the successful interagency work I've been a part of has complemented capabilities, not tried to replicate them or duplicate them or compete with them. So If an agency brings along a particular set of skills that I find desirable, draw on their skills, don't try and create it myself. Or if you need to create it yourself, maybe over the longer term, but draw on their skills, understand what they bring to the table and use it. You know, I think that's really important to the success of any task force as well. And, you know, I'm not sure if I said it before, but it really is incredible what you can achieve if nobody cares who has the limelight at the end of the day. So that's important as well.
So number 8 is one of my favourite questions, and you mentioned that you got a phone call from the Prime Minister. How do you distill political and strategic guidance into your leadership, vision, roles and responsibilities?
Yeah, look, I think the role of any senior manager and or leader, and you know, they're not necessarily, leadership is all levels of the organisation in my mind, but in those senior roles, you've got to take someone's strategic objectives and make it meaningful. So in many ways, recovery from the bushfire was a pretty easy sell. The PM wanted to ensure that the Commonwealth was doing everything it could to assist the communities affected by the bushfires. My job was to translate that into something meaningful for an organisation. It depends on the role of the task force. I mean, in my policing days, we were very operationally independent, so politics didn't play a role in what we were trying to do. But in this agency, I'm delivering government policy. So the policy around grants for farmers or businesses is government policy. I've got to translate that and deliver it. So there is a political strategic objective. My job is to stay very clear of that, but translate it. And the way I do that is quite simply, what does it mean to me? What do I think that the agency needs to translate from that? What does it mean to the victims? What does it mean to the community? And then give effect to it.
We had a chat about your observed change of actors coming together from need to desire. Are you able to share some of your reflections on what you think influences organisations and individuals to progress towards a desire to work together?
Yeah, common experiences would probably be the number one from my perspective. And if I think back about policing, and in that 30 years that I was a police officer, I saw just a very distinctive step change from police always working together, but staying within their lanes and being comfortable within their lanes, to police moving to a far more trusted environment where, you know, we're much more genuine and authentic in our joint arrangements. The change for policing was the mid-90s and late 90s, leading up to, you know, the attacks in New York and Pennsylvania and DC, 9/11. Then the Bali bombings. That really brought a step change in the minds of policing here, because all of a sudden we realised that crime was global, crime was far beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and we needed to work together, and it made more sense to work together. So that, to me, was the catalyst for something that led policing down a different path through the 2000s into where we are today, where I think task forces are just a very common part of the framework. They come, they go, they form, they close, but there's a desire to work together, not just with policing partners, often with our non-policing partners, in a way that didn't exist when I joined the police force.
What top 3 lessons would you like to share with future leaders who will work in multi-agency environments?
Look, I've probably said them before, you know, don't just have a shared objective, have a shared vision. So know how you want to achieve the objective. Don't replicate and duplicate capabilities, complement each other. Try and see things from the other person's perspective. Understand what the other agency or the other person in the arrangement wants to get out of it. If it's a joint leadership arrangement, what does the other senior officer want to try and achieve? If it's another agency, what are their objectives? We far too often look at what we're trying to achieve only through our lens. We need to sometimes put ourselves in the shoes of the other partner and see what they're trying to achieve. And I think if you do that, and as I said, if we care less about who receives the limelight and just that we get the job done, then that's the hallmarks of a successful task force.
Can we talk a little bit about the command and control? Because I've had a look through the location of the agency, and also, as you mentioned, the deputy coordinator.
Yep.
How was that structure stood up, and your thoughts on its position and who is part of that structure?
Wire diagrams and structures look very binary, when in reality I think what you're trying to achieve is integration. And you know, the principle that I use it in policing, I'm translating it to this agency is no one person should be successful in what they're trying to do without somebody else in the agency helping them. So yes, you need accountabilities and you need to be very clear about who's accountable, but unless you want to create stovepipes where nobody's sharing, you've got to find ways to create interdependencies. So for someone to do their job, they need somebody else to be doing their job. So we've tried to do that across the agency, and while you've got to find that balance, I need to have executives who are accountable and I know I can turn to. I also need to know that, you know, if I've got 2 deputies, for instance, I want each of them to understand each other's business very well. I want each of them to understand who their senior officers are and what they're doing and what their pressures are and what their challenges are. We're small enough to be able to do that. If you're talking about something the size of the ADF, maybe that's a little bit harder, but I'd argue that it's not, because even in something the size of the ADF, it's lots of small organisations, it's lots of small branches. If you use that interdependency model and understanding that nobody should be successful without somebody else, then I think that leads to a far more integrated workforce.
And Margis, I'm going to be speaking with Mr. Willing next week, Mick Willing. So it just came to my mind then is that how is the National Recovery Agency linked to the state recovery agencies?
Yep. So it'll be interesting what Mick says.
It just came to my mind just then, but I'm
no, it's good. I'm glad you are, and I know Mick well. So in actual fact, it worked as a real advantage, and we need to be honest about this and call it out. If you know somebody, it makes it a lot easier in those crazy times to work together. And Mick and I knew each other well, so we put aside very quickly any jurisdictional challenges, any personality challenges, and just agreed that we wanted to work together and share information. So we would talk regularly, because New South Wales is the biggest jurisdiction that I needed to deal with. That helps. It helped that he was also from a police background as well, so we probably had shared experiences. But pushing all that aside, I think what helped is in both Mick and I believe you had 2 people who were less worried about what their own stake in the issue was and more worried about trying to do a good job. And that's important. And you know, New South Wales were dealing with a problem and a magnitude of a scale they hadn't dealt with before. They were extremely open and willing to share that problem with the Commonwealth, as they should have been. And I took that perspective I talked before of what's our value add. How do I make Mick Willing's job easier? How do I make Mick successful? How do I make person X successful? And that's what I go about trying to do. And that's what we, not I, that's what the agency's going about trying to do.
I think that covers everything. Thank you, Andrew. As mentioned, it just came to my mind then that it's like,
he's a good one to talk to.
Yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to everyone, but yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And just that little bit gives me a bit more context to take it into talking to him. So, thank you very much for your time.